let's talk about the two most important things in prison. And they are where you live and who you live with. Because obviously some prisons or even areas within prisons are going to be better than others, and the person you live with means a difference between going back to the cell at night, making a meal and having a conversation, and somebody who's stealing from you, or somebody's coming after you with a lock and a sock, somebody who overdoses and you feel guilt over their loss of life, or you're even blamed for their loss of life. So let's start with where you live. Now, initially in classification, you don't have any control over where you go, though I was actually given the choice of 3 prisons to apply to go to. Didn't mean that's where I was going to go, but I could ask to go there once my security level classification was made. And I wanted to be at a prison that, 1, had cells, and I didn't have an option because I wasn't low level at that point, and 2, I wanted to be close to home because I knew just how important visits were. So I got to that prison, and then the question was, how do I want to live, or where do I want to live? Well, it was a place we were locked down all the time. There was nothing to do. It was miserable. It was just like a terrible environment. So I wanted a job that would allow me to be outside of that cell, because being locked in that cell for 20 hours a day or 16 hours a day is just not a good experience. So I got a job in the wood shop. That meant I got to get up early in the morning, go to work in the wood shop, work with tools, work with hammers, work with saws, do all this different stuff. And then when I got back at the end of the day, it was a period that we were allowed to be out of our cells. That gave me the opportunity to work, to make money, and to move around and never feel like I was stuck in a certain place. Now, over time, I kind of evolved into where I wanted to live. So the way the pods were set up is you had 16 cells, 8 on the bottom and 8 on the top. And I realized, hey, I'd rather be on the top tier than the bottom, because that meant there were fewer people in front of my door. There was nobody in front of my door shooting dice or banging or hitting on the table, so it would be a little bit quieter. There'd be less noise, there'd be less smells, there'd be less conflict. You didn't have to worry about somebody getting into a fight and just like falling into your cell, because that would happen in the bottom tier cells pretty regularly. I wanted to be on the top tier. And then how do I refine that? Well, I wanted to be in a good pod. The woodshop pod was a good pod, and over the years that kind of changed. But I also wanted to be on the top tier near the end, because the stairs were in the middle. So the only reason you would have to go to that end cell is if you were going to see somebody in that end cell, which meant if you were on the end, you had a lot less traffic. It was a lot quieter. It was just a lot easier to kind of do your time and be left alone. It also meant for the tattoo man or guys making wine, you had longer times between when the cops could get in and get up to your cell, because they had to go through that whole path. But for me, it was just about being left alone. And I was like, well, what are the things I can do to be a little more comfortable in here? Well, I wanted a toilet that had a toilet seat, because they started under the new system to have these toilets that are just the bowl and no seat, so what you pee on is what you sit on, and that's one of the reasons some guys like pee kneeling or they pee sitting down, because they say we've got to keep this clean because we don't have any way to do it. So if I could pay a maintenance guy or move into a cell that had a toilet with a toilet seat, that just felt like a small luxury. It was one of those things. And then there were the lockers. So we had foot lockers, which is metal boxes, or in another prison there were plastic boxes. And then we have lockers on the wall. So you could get a big one or a small one. And the whole thing was, it was just more space to put your stuff. And again, it was about saving money. The DOC used to have the big ones, and they decided, hey, we don't want to keep paying for these, so we're going to get the small one. So you had half the size to put your stuff. So if you needed to put your clothes or lock your commissary or whatever you were going to do, it was better to have a bigger locker, because plus that gave you a bigger area on top to cook your food or draw. It was basically like a table, because we didn't have any tables in the cell. So between the toilet and that, and then when they installed the plumbing system, because for this water-saving technology, they put a limit on the number of flushes you could have. So if you flushed too many times, it was 2 times in 5 minutes, the toilet would lock out and you couldn't flush it for another hour. And living in a place, especially at Nottoway, where we were locked down all the time, where we'd go on 2-week lockdowns, you wanted to be able to flush the toilet when you were locked in the cell with another person, at least do a courtesy flush. And if you got to drop it 2 times, great. If you got to drop it 3, you're in trouble because you can't flush it again for an hour. So we would pay the guys on maintenance to fix that. We would pay the guys to actually upgrade the system and bypass what it was. We could flush as many times as we want. So again, these were just small things. These small things made a difference. Some people would wax their floors or actually wax designs into their floors because their whole goal was, how do I make this as comfortable as possible? And a lot of people say, well, I don't want you to be comfortable. This isn't a Hilton. You committed a crime. But the problem is people are trying to change their lives. It's like something you did 5 years or 10 years or 20 years ago. If somebody's still kicking you for that, that isn't allowing you to change. That isn't allowing you to become a better person. That is keeping you stuck in that trauma, that is keeping you stuck in that place. It's like basically saying, hey, I'm going to punish you for what you did as a kid. It just doesn't really make sense. You can hold people accountable and you can hold them there as they build the skills and tools they need to move forward, but actively punishing them just does not give them the chance to be better or do better. Once that became the case, I knew I wanted to live in a cell, I wanted to live in a top cell, I wanted to have these couple little things, but then the question was, who did I want to live with? Initially, I thought, I want to live with somebody I really like. I want to live with a good friend. I went through a lot of iterations of that. I had a lot of terrible cell partners. I had one guy who stole from me. I had one guy who was just genuinely psychotic. Eventually, I figured out I didn't actually want to live with a friend or somebody I was close to, because there was too much conflict, because we liked each other, or we interacted a lot, or we cared, so what it did was create the opportunity for conflict where it didn't need to be. Remember Billy and I love Billy to death. We got along great, but we also almost got into a fist fight, and we argued about stuff, and we went back and forth because there was just too much overlap. So what I realized was the person I lived with, I wanted somebody to be clean and trustworthy, and I wanted to be somebody that I liked, but that I wasn't close to. Because what that created was a situation, and I had this with a couple guys, where we could talk, but we could also not talk, and it wasn't uncomfortable. So we might sit down and have a 2.5-hour conversation. We might also not talk for 3 or 4 days, and it didn't make a difference. It didn't, make it uncomfortable or put a problem in our relationship. It allowed us to just coexist in that way. I wanted somebody who could communicate. I always got up early in the morning, so I would get up early in the morning, go to breakfast, and then I would always have to ask my roommate when they first moved in, or I first moved in, hey, what do you want to do about the toilet, and what do you want to do about these other situations? If I need to use the bathroom, do you want me to wake you up if you're sleeping, or do you want me to just hang the curtain and use the bathroom? Hey, how do we communicate about these things? And I had a roommate for the longest time who had a different schedule than me. I would always be back from chow before him, so I had the room to myself to use the bathroom. Then I would leave, I would go sit down on the bottom tier, and I would drink my cup of coffee while he used the bathroom. We had a routine where we were conscious of each other's needs, we respected each other, and it got to the point we didn't even have to talk. If we needed to, we could say, hey, look, this is what I need, or this isn't cool, or hey, please don't do that, or will you please do this? But we got along because there was no closeness, there was just communication. Now, on the other hand, I've had complete opposites. I've had people who are total slobs and wouldn't, share in the cleaning duties, or I had people that were just incompatible because they always wanted to have people in the cell and be gambling and making noise and being crazy, and I just wanted to chill. So it was about finding those people that we could live in compatible ways, and once I found that, my time was 10 times better. It actually allowed me to be a better person, allowed me to grow more, to do more, to read more, to learn more. And if it was the right situation, it allowed me to learn from that person I was living with and allowed them to learn from me. But once I figured those things out, that I had to pick where I was living and make it the best opportunity I could, or make it the best environment that I could, and I had to pick the person I was living with and make that the best possible, it was a good situation. But it isn't always that easy. Because at Nottoway, for example, when I first got there, it was a level 4 prison. This was the first 4 years of my prison time. You couldn't pick where you lived or who you lived with. Or you could, but you weren't allowed to. So if you were living in a cell and you were unhappy, and you put in for a move, they wouldn't say, okay, you can move to this cell because you're compatible with this person or you want to be in this spot. They would move you randomly across the compound, maybe to another cell, maybe to another pod, maybe to the other side of the yard. You had no way of knowing it. Same thing with a roommate. If you didn't get along, they would tell you, hey, just tough it out, or hey, you guys fight it out, it's not our problem. But eventually it started to shift a little bit when I got later in time, and there was a lieutenant who was saying, hey, don't write it on the form because I'm not allowed to do this, but make a note, put the sticky note on there, you want to go to this cell with this person, I'll make it happen. I just can't tell them that's what I'm doing. So it got to the point that even the lieutenants or the building managers or whoever was in charge of the moves recognized that what they were doing didn't make sense and made for more problems. Because you telling two guys to just fight it out is basically saying you want to have to come in and clean up the blood and write the charges and deal with the conflict, not to mention putting people at risk of harm or even for their lives because you don't want to make a move. That just doesn't make sense. And people like that lieutenant realized, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. And thankfully, when I got to Buckingham, they understood that. They said, look, our job is to stay out of the way as much as possible. Your job is to stay out of the way as much as possible. So if you need a move, tell us. We'll move you. If you need a new situation, tell us. We'll do it. Now, obviously, if people tried to abuse that or move every week or do something, they wouldn't do that. But if you're like, hey, man, this guy and I are about to go to blows, we got a problem, they'd say, cool, let's separate you so you guys don't fight about it because we don't want to clean up the blood. We don't want to give people charges. We don't want to make it any more difficult. And being there allowed me to, again, really kind of begin to develop who I wanted to be because I had an environment and people that I was living around that were compatible. This is translated to the world. Even I don't have a roommate out here. I live by myself because one of my priorities was to live by myself because I didn't get to do that. I know how to communicate. When I was living with Courtney, we knew how to communicate about, hey, I need this or I don't need this, or would you do this or would you not do this? Being able to have that basic communication skills, I learned that better with roommates in prison than I ever did in relationships or ever did out here in the world. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really helpful. The other thing about communication was I had to verbalize everything, both with roommates in prison, but especially with people on the outside. So if I had a girlfriend or a friend, we couldn't just go do things together. We couldn't just explore and figure out. We had to verbalize. We had to actually vocalize the things we wanted or felt or needed. And that taught me a lot about communication. It taught me a lot about being aware of what I was actually feeling or actually wanting or actually needing. So in a weird way, the experience of prison and learning how much I can and can't control my environment and how to choose the people I want to be around and then how to communicate allowed me to become a better person, a better roommate, a better partner, better all those things, because in a weird way, the deprivation of that environment allowed me to actually become better at things and show up as a better person.